A Great Argead Saga Alexein, Alexander the Great Volume 1. Telesias, the War Dance. By Naki. Episode 42. Collision of Bronze and Steel. As Pelopidas executed a sharp, aggressive forward stride, his heavy bronze breastplate caught the erratic glare of the great hall's pine torches, releasing a volatile, frantic illumination that danced like wildfire across the stone walls. Completely bypassing Regent Ptolemy's pathetic sycophantic posturing, the Theban commander advanced with unblinking, predatory intent directly toward the monumental limestone pillar, against which General Attalus maintained his frame. The atmosphere of the court collapsed into a suffocating death silence. Every eye within the administrative center instantaneously locked onto this fragile micro-negative second, where the physical realities of the two leaders compressed. The 42-year-old titan of southern warfare and the 22-year-old northern wolf, actively measuring each other's geostrategic mass. "Your reputation has navigated the distance to my ears," Pelopidas announced, his heavy baritone echoing through the structural timber beams of the ceiling with a resonant, absolute weight that caused more than one courtier to take a step back. "It is articulated that the true metric of a hoplite phalanx resides exclusively within the stark severity of its bloodlines. You cut the precise dimensions of the youth Attalus, descended from the lords of Orestes." Though his age barely bypassed 20 winters, the young commander radiated an abnormal, statuesque stillness unique to those forged from ancient lineage, and tempered within the crucible of a Highland slaughterhouse. Inside, Attalus's blood boomed like war drums. Let him look, his ego snarled in the quiet vaults of his mind. Let this old southern dog sniff around my boots. He thinks he commands a room of frightened boys. He has not faced the pure blood of the peaks. Pelopidas's sharp, slate-gray pupils refused to execute a solitary blink. "During my prior tenure at the court of Susa as an ambassador to the great king, I audited the empire's supreme intelligence scrolls and verified your family's name legibly carved into the parchment. The memory of the Persians is a relentless machine. Their administrators meticulously record the mountain barons who arrested the momentum of the satrap's legions and deadlocked the western passes." The young Attalus executed a microscopic adjustment of his posture, yet his countenance preserved a carefully calibrated mask of insolent pride. To have his martial dimension authenticated by the Lion of Thebes was the ultimate certification of structural capability. Yet the stark, chilling reality that his family's existence was under constant surveillance by the King of Kings across the sea served as a volatile warning. "Susa records my bloodline," Attalus thought, an intoxicating surge of destiny drowning out the chill of the warning. "Even the great king fears what we can do when the passes are closed. And this Theban thinks a piece of parchment gives him dominion over me." Within the inner circles of Thebes, Pelopidas continued, his lips contorting into a razor-thin smile of clinical detachment. "It is computed that the young of a mountain lion requires zero instruction in the secondary arts of the hunt. It is structurally sufficient to instruct its intellect in a solitary equation, exactly where to drive the spear to pierce the heart. For the survival of Macedonia, I entertain the expectation that the administrative ledgers of the Persian Empire will be forced to accommodate significantly more names from your house." Young Attalus remained entirely motionless, but his right palm, obeying a deeply grooved biological habit, clamped down onto the gold leaf pommel of his sword. The metal was cold against his hot skin. The Persians possess an exceptional capacity to archive the names of those who deadlocked their legions, Attalus rasped, his voice cutting through the damp chill of the hall like an iron file. "But within this palace of Pella, our memory functions exclusively to record the names of those who march uninvited through our city gates with the boots of an occupier. Tell me, General, do you navigate this floor as a legitimate friend of the crown, or have you descended upon our soil as a predatory merchant, engineered to buy up the remaining fractions of our native pride at a bankrupt price?" Young Attalus watched the exchange from the periphery, his chest tightening with a savage, intoxicating mix of anticipation and disdain. Finally, he thought, his fingers twitching against the pommel of his blade as he tracked the subtle shift in the Theban's posture. The old man finally drops the pretense of diplomacy. He looked at the nervous guards and the paralyzed, sweating form of the regent, his lip curling into a sneer of pure, unfiltered contempt. "Look at them, cowering like sheep while the wolf sets the table. They hold their breaths, terrified that a single loud word will bring the walls down upon their heads. They don't see the opportunity in this collision. They only see the end of their comfortable, stagnant lives. His gaze flicked back to Pelopidas, his pulse hammering against his ribs like a war drum. Let him try to answer. Let him justify his intrusion. If he speaks of peace, he's a liar. If he speaks of power, he's a target. Young Attalus shifted his weight, his stance unconsciously widening, ready to spring. The silence in this room is a coiled snake, and I am the only one here who actually wants to hear it strike. Let the Theban push. Let the region fail. I'm tired of waiting for a crown that hasn't the guts to defend itself. The collective, terrified intake of breath rippled through the assembled Macedonian barons. Parmenian's hand twitched, his mind screaming at the young general's reckless lunacy. The boy is courting our execution, Parmenian audited frantically, his eyes shifting to the Theban vanguard waiting at the door. The clinical smile upon Pelopidas's features mutated instantaneously into a lethal, incandescent rage. The sheer psychological mass of the man seemed to expand, darkening the torchlight. I have descended upon the soil to completely paralyze a geopolitical crisis. Pelopidas hissed, his voice dropping into a register that vibrated through the flagstones. To prevent this territory of Macedonia from transforming into an absolute yawning burial pit whose internal rot spills over to contaminate the plains of Greece. Thebes entertains zero interest in your primitive provincial pride. Our intellect demands a solitary parameter: absolute stability. A dark kingdom that executes the slaughter of its own sovereign amidst the choreography of a festival dance is an open invitation for neighboring empires to permanently redraw its borderlines at their leisure. And your intellect fantasizes that the systematic abduction of our offspring constitutes the definition of stability? Young Attalus surged forward, compressing the distance until their bronze breastplates were a mere heartbeat from a ringing physical collision. The raw, unrefined aura of a wild predator radiated from the 22-year-old's frame, his hot breath visible in the freezing air of the hall. You starve for the flesh of Philip because your strategy has computed that the Argead bloodline is the solitary thread holding these fragmented mountain clans in check. You desire to plunder the future seed of our nation and plant it deep within the stagnant mud of Boeotia. I extract those boys to forcefully hammer the absolute aesthetic of an authentic military apparatus into their pupils. Pelopidas roared, his mask of clinical detachment completely pulverizing as his thunderous voice vibrated through the very structural foundations of the great hall. I export their intellect to carve an immortal truth into their blood and fiber. Power is no cowardly dagger wielded in the dark, but the unyielding line of the unbroken shield wall that executes zero parameters of retreat. Pelopidas leaned down, his face inches from Attalus's eyes, his expression utterly terrifying. Attalus, if your frame inherited a solitary fraction of your father's mass, you would have utilized your own two palms to strangle that usurper Ptolemy to death before soliciting the spears of an alien empire to clean your own house. The tension in the room snapped like an overdrawn bowstring. Attalus's countenance flushed a lethal, dangerous crimson, his fingers clamping onto his weapon's hilt with enough velocity to white his knuckles to the bone. Behind his spine, the elite companions, heteroi, initiated a simultaneous, menacing forward movement, their heavy wool mantles parting to expose the raw, cold gleam of bronze and iron. Let it break, Attalus thought, his ego burning with a manic, chaotic ecstasy. Let the blood flow here. Let us see how deep his phalanx matches against our steel. Enough. Eurydice's voice cut through the chamber like a fracturing sheet of ice, absolute, unyielding, and weighted with a definitive sovereign command that instantly bisected the volatile chaos. She stepped forward, her dark robes whipping around her like a shroud. General Attalus, calculate your proper dimensions within this court. Lord Pelopidas constitutes a supreme guest of state, officially welcomed by the decree of my crown. Young Attalus remained completely rigid, his gaze drilling directly into the pupils of the Theban general for a silent, agonizing micro-negative second that felt like an eternity. The air between them remained heavy, hot, and dense, vibrating with the unspoken mathematical certainty of future bloodshed. Neither man blinked. It was a pure collision of opposing masses, a territorial deadlock where the slightest tremor would ignite a massacre. Old Attalus took a single, deliberate step forward, his wooden staff striking the stone floor with a dry, hollow crack that echoed through the sudden, suffocating silence. He did not look at the Queen Mother, though he felt the searing heat of her gaze. His eyes, clouded by age but still sharp with the cold, cynical clarity of a man who had seen the kingdom's borders shrink decade by decade, remained locked on the Theban. "A supreme guest, your majesty," Old Attalus rasped, his voice a gravelly drag against the silence. He shifted his weight, his gnarled hand whitening as it gripped the staff until his knuckles stood out like polished bone. One does not typically welcome a guest who keeps his hand firmly on the hilt of his sword while he sits at your table. If we are to trade our future for this protection, let us at least stop pretending we are guests at a wedding, rather than lambs in a slaughterhouse. Look at them, he thought, the bitterness rising in his throat like bile as he glanced from the fire in young Attalus's eyes to the trembling, inadequate posture of the regent. The youth is a torch held in a room full of dry straw, and the regent is a man who thinks he can negotiate with the gale. They play at statecraft while the foundations of the House of Argead are being mined by the very men we are inviting inside. He looked back at Pelopidas, his expression hardening into a grim, mask-like resignation. He isn't even insulted. He watches us tear at each other, counting the fissures in our resolve like a mason measuring the cracks in a failing wall. He knows what we are, a fractured, desperate line of kings and queens, too blinded by our own pride to realize we have already been dismantled. If I speak, I draw their eyes upon me, he realized, a cold shiver tracing the line of his spine despite the heat of the hall. If I stay silent, I become an accomplice to the murder of this kingdom. We are shouting at the tide, hoping to command it to retreat, while the water is already up to our waists. History is not written by the hospitable general, Old Attalus added, his voice dropping to a low, ominous rumble that carried the weight of a final warning. It is written by the survivors. And I suspect that when the fire in this room finally dies, the ashes will not be able to tell the difference between a friend and an occupier. It is enough, the old vanguard thought, his chest aching with the sheer exhaustion of the spectacle. I'm tired of watching this pantomime of ego. No wonder the kingdom rots from its foundation. They are too busy sharpening knives for one another's backs to see the throat of the state being slit. He toyed with the idea of retirement, a quiet life far from the machinations of Pella. But to leave now is to guarantee the collapse. If I walk away, the vacuum will swallow what little remains. Even if Thebes secures the borders, this house will tear itself apart before the first harvest. He felt a wave of profound detachment. He no longer had the appetite for the regent's games or the queen's cold-blooded math. Perhaps I can retreat to the northern outposts, he mused, a grim resolve hardening his heart. I can defend the soil, if not the crown. I will let them have their court, so long as I do not have to watch them burn it down. Finally, young Attalus's lips twisted into a mask of supreme, insolent mockery. The muscles in his throat corded as he forced his hand away from his sword, though his fingers trembled with the raw, repressed violence of a leashed hound. He slowly executed a microscopic tilt of his head toward the Queen Mother, his eyes flashing with a silent, treasonous promise that spoke louder than any shout. "A guest, you classify him," he muttered, his voice dropping into a gravelly sneer that violently tossed the title onto the limestone flags like a piece of spoiled meat. He looked back at Pelopidas, his eyes narrowing to razor slits. "Then let us entertain the hope that this guest thoroughly consumes the parameters of our hospitality. But archive this down into your intellect, Theban. The soil of Macedonia possesses a highly peculiar habit of completely digesting the flesh of those who choose to overstay their welcome within our gates. We bury our invaders deep." He executed an arrogant turn, deliberately presenting his spine squarely to the Theban titan, a final, lethal insult that made the Boeotian bodyguards tighten their grips on their shields. Attalus strode out of the great hall, the heavy bronze plates of his greaves ringing against the stone. With every thunderous thud of his boots, he radiated a wordless, crystalline challenge toward the young King Perdiccas as he passed the throne. A public declaration that the crown was nothing but a fragile toy, waiting for a real man to seize it. Watching this dark theater execute from the absolute freezing shadow of the monumental stone columns, 14-year-old Philip did not move a single muscle. His pulse remained perfectly steady, a slow, rhythmic counterpoint to the chaotic panic vibrating through the court. His mind was a quiet, freezing alpine lake, undisturbed by the emotional storm of the warlords. He mapped the supreme equation of the encounter into his cerebral cortex, with flawless architectural clarity. Young Attalus is an unmitigated fool, the young prince realized, his slate-gray eyes tracking the general's arrogant exit, before shifting back to the massive, heavily breathing form of Pelopidas. He thinks Highland pride can deflect a cornelwood spear. He thinks loud anger is power. He wants to bleed beautifully, just to prove his blood is pure. But he understands nothing of statecraft. Philippus' gaze drifted from Attalus's retreating shadow back to the mud-stained, indomitable presence of the Theban commander. But this Theban, Philippus' inner dialogue sharpened into a cold, reverent focus. This Theban just demonstrated the ultimate reality of the world. Power is not a man shouting on a rock. Power is a machine. It is a clinical, flawlessly synchronized apparatus of bronze, deep columns, and unyielding logistics that does not care about native pride or ancient lineages. It simply flattens what stands in its path. Philip tightened the heavy wool of his cloak around his 14-year-old frame, feeling the slightness of his own bone structure compared to the giants before him. His gray eyes locked onto his brother Perdiccas's trembling crown, watching the bronze diadem catch the flickering, dying torchlight. This blood alliance is by no means a treaty of peace, the young prince concluded, a dark, brilliant resolve anchoring itself into the marrow of his bones. It is the clinical, systematic tightening of an iron vice that has merely granted our survival a temporary stay of execution. Ptolemy thinks I am a useless hostage. Attalus thinks I am a discarded piece. Let them. I will go to their city of Thebes. I will sit at their tables, walk their gridirons, and watch their sacred band. I will dissect the inner matrix of their machine until I know every screw, every shield link, and every tactical variable. And then I will bring it back to the north and use it to crush every single man in this room. The morning light in Lysandra's shop was a thin gray blade that sliced through the pungent haze of dried mugwort and crushed garlic. Before the market had even fully awakened, the cycle of the city's quiet decay had already begun. She did not look for miracles. She dealt in the arithmetic of survival. The first was a weaver, his hands stained dark with indigo, his chest rattling with a sound like dry parchment being crumpled. Tuberculosis. She didn't need to see the blood-flecked spittle in his rag to know the wasting had taken root. She offered him a poultice of wild lettuce and poppy, not to cure the incurable, but to quiet the cough that kept him from the rest he so desperately needed. He took it with a shaking hand, his eyes dull. He knew, as she did, that the weave of his life was fraying at the edges. Eat the broth, she told him, her voice low and devoid of the false cheer of the temple physicians. And keep your blankets dry. The damp is the enemy. He nodded, a ghost of a man, and vanished back into the shadows of the market. Before the stool was cold, a woman entered, clutching a bundled infant whose skin held the sickly, jaundiced tint of a marsh fever. Malaria. The mother's eyes were wide, rimmed with the exhaustion of weeks spent hovering over a cooling brow. Lysandra examined the child, the hot, dry skin, the shallow breath. The fever will break by nightfall, Lysandra said, measuring out a decoction of willow bark. It was the only armor she had against the intermittent shudders that racked the small frame. Keep the water cool. If the fever rises again before the moon sets, come back. Do not wait for the sun. The day unfolded as a steady, relentless procession of the city's invisible attrition. There was the porter with dysentery, his insides screaming from the tainted water of a public cistern. She gave him a charcoal-based astringent N, a warning that he would likely starve to death if he did not stop drinking from the city's shared bowls. There was the elderly widow, with a bronchial fire in her lungs, clinging to life with the desperate tenacity of a vine on a crumbling wall. Lysandra worked with the rhythmic, detached precision of a weaver. She was not fighting a war against a sudden, dramatic plague. She was fighting a daily, grinding attrition. These were the diseases of the city's architecture, the filth of the streets, the crowding of the tenements, the contaminated veins of the wells. By midday, her hands were stained with the tinctures of her trade, her senses dulled by the constant inhalation of medicinal smoke. She watched a group of citizens pass by the window, debating the politics of the assembly with loud, vibrant energy, their voices projecting a sense of eternal vigor. They were the ones who wrote the histories, the ones who debated the forms and the good. They never saw the stream of people who visited her shop. To the city, these deaths were merely the background noise of life, the inevitable, unremarkable shedding of the weak. Lysandra picked up her pestle, the stone cold and smooth against her palm. She breathed in the scent of her own shop, earthy, medicinal, and stubbornly resilient. She would finish this batch, clean her tools, and wait for the next rattling breath at her door. In a city that prided itself on logic, she was the one who tended to the body's failure to obey it. The curtain to her shop parted then with a sharp, metallic rattle, and a man stumbled in, his breath coming in jagged, wet rasps. He was broad-shouldered, a man whose frame had been forged by the ceaseless labor of the dockyards, a shipwright, judging by the calluses and the lingering scent of pine pitch and caulking tar that clung to his tunic. He gripped the counter, his knuckles white, and dropped a heavy, splintered piece of oak onto the table. It was etched with a crude, singular symbol, a stylized trireme hull, the mark of the Piraeus Guild. "Healer," he grunted, his face pale and slicked with sweat. He pressed a hand to his side, his fingers disappearing into a dark, congealing stain that had already begun to ruin his linen chiton. A gaff hook slipped under the weight of a hull planking. It went deep. Lysandra didn't hesitate. She ushered him toward the stool, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of one who saw the city's violence on a daily basis. As she cut away the ruined fabric, revealing a nasty, jagged tear that pulsed with the heat of encroaching infection, she noticed the man's eyes. They were not focused on his own wound. They were tracking the shadows of her shop, darting toward the vial of poppy tincture she had just returned to her kit. "I've stitched better than this, shipwright," she said, her voice clinical and detached. She began cleansing the raw flesh with a sharp, stinging wash of vinegar and thyme. "You'll live to see the next ship launched, provided you don't drink yourself into a fever." The man sucked in a sharp breath as the sting took hold, but he didn't pull away. He grabbed her wrist, his grip surprisingly strong for a man losing blood. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, desperate vibration that barely carried over the muffled sound of the market outside. "It's not for me," he whispered, his gaze intense, searching hers. "I saw you at the harbor 3 nights ago, near the drainage vents. I saw you carry the bag into the dark." Lysandra's hands froze, the needle hovering just above the torn flesh. She didn't flinch, but the atmosphere in the room shifted, turning as cold as the stone floor. She looked at him, her eyes unblinking, assessing the risk in his pulse. "You speak of things you should leave to the silence of the tunnels," she said softly, her tone a blade wrapped in velvet. "They aren't just animals, healer." The man hissed, his eyes glistening with a sudden, raw empathy. "There's a boy, maybe 10 winters, hiding in the crawl spaces beneath the naval storehouses. A fever has him, and the guards, they'll toss him in the sea if they find him before the rot does. He doesn't need stitching. He needs the dark. He needs the stillness you bring." He squeezed her wrist, his voice breaking. "I can't get to him. The watch is too tight, and he's too weak to crawl out. They're fading, Lysandra, down there in the dark. They fade away into the mud, and no one cares enough to count their passing." Lysandra stared at him, the weight of the request settling into the room. He was a man who built ships meant to command the waves, yet here he was, asking her to tend to the debris that washed up on the shore. "If I go," she said, her voice devoid of sympathy but heavy with the weight of an unwritten vow, "I go alone. If anyone asks, I'm in the market looking for mallow root. And if you are found near those vents, you don't know me. You don't know the tunnel. You don't know the existence of the dying." The shipwright let out a shuddering breath and loosened his grip on her wrist. "Understood," he rasped, bowing his head in gratitude. Lysandra picked up her needle, the thread tight and ready. "Keep your silence, shipwright. It is the only thing currently keeping that boy and perhaps you among the living." To be continued in episode 43, Princes of the Shadow. A Great Argead Saga Alexein. Volume 1, Telesias, the War Dance. A new episode every single day. We are dropping a new episode every day until the epic conclusion of Volume 1. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 5 to 15-minute hit of cinematic historical drama, perfect for your daily plunge into antiquity. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full saga now. Bookmark Volume 1, Telesias playlist. Subscribe to follow the rise of the Argead Dynasty. Thumbs up to help push our vanguard through the algorithm's gauntlet. Comment below. Is Philip's cold, calculated silence a sign of his submission or the first step in his mastery of the Theban machine?